Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Tisky Sour. It's a Monday, which means I have the privilege of being joined by both Ash Sarkar and Aaron Bastani. How are you both doing?
Feeling fine. How about you?
Yeah, good. I'm glad you're feeling fine because as we're going to get onto a topic in a little bit, that you've had, I suppose you could say, a difficult weekend. You've had a weekend where lots of people have been trying to make your life difficult. We'll have to see, how you've dealt with it.
And that was just you moving in with me temporarily.
I like to feel like that was one of the positive elements of last week. But yeah. Viewers of Tisky Sour would have noticed that last week I had Ash's background instead of my own. Aaron, any big news from you?
No, I mean, no. Ash's weekend was just, I wouldn't even call it a bad weekend. No, it was surreal. I thought I'd taken drugs.
Yeah.
I thought this can't be happening. I must have taken like a gram of ketamine on Friday night, and now there's loads of people calling Ash a terrorist sympathizer because she's tweeted the emoji of an orange. But no, that is real life.
Three oranges.
That is going to be one of our stories tonight. We'll get to that in about 10 minutes. The move of Britain's political right from Twitter to a new app called Parler or Parler. I'll have to find out from the other two how I'm actually supposed to pronounce it. And we're also going to talk about Trump's first election rally. It was as surreal as one would expect, and whether or not TikTok has spawned a pretty effective movement, I suppose, with real political impact. And we'll also talk about how when pubs reopen, it might not be as we remember them. First, though, tweet on the hashtag Tisky Sour and share the show link. Our first story is the one that has been leading the news today and yesterday, which is that on Saturday evening, 3 people were sadly killed after a man attacked multiple members of the public with a knife in a park in central Reading. Most news coverage today has focused on the perpetrator. This is how the BBC describe what we know so far. So Khairi Sadala, a 25-year-old local man, is being held by police over the attack. Security sources have told the BBC that Mr. Sadala, who is thought to be a Libyan national, was known to MI5. They said the suspect had come to the attention of the security services over information he had aspirations to travel abroad, potentially for terrorism. When their information was further investigated as the first stage of looking into a potential lead, no genuine threat or immediate risk was identified. There are about 3,000 people under investigation by MI5 over extremist activity. Mr. Sadala was among a further 40,000 names in the agency system, but who were not under active investigation. So as is often the case, actually, in these attacks, the government gets under some pressure because the perpetrator, the person who carried it out, was known to security services. Let's have a look at what Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, had to say about this today.
The security services have records on thousands of people, and rightly so, subjects of interest, people of concern. There is very little I can say, but at the end of the day, when it comes to MI5 and our intelligence and security services, they work intensively to look at the backgrounds of individuals to see what kind of risk they pose. What we saw here on Saturday evening in Reading was the actions of one lone individual. We should bear that in mind. The police have that individual in custody. They're not looking for anybody else. We should all remain alert. We should all remain vigilant in terms of the fact that threats are all around us, but we've just got to respond in the right kind of way and be very mindful of, the type of society that we live in.
So I suppose a couple of things to note there. One, she's sort of highlighting it's a lone attack. And I suppose that does mean that there's a potential move from the right to say the only way you can stop lone attacks, because you can't really, intercept the planning of them, is to police what people are thinking about, which is, pretty worrying. And then the other point to note really is that here you have Priti Patel herself, a very authoritarian Home Secretary who's trying to justify the fact that someone who was known to the security services wasn't, apprehended, or there wasn't a more authoritarian response to them before they got to carry out an attack. That's an argument that comes from the right. I think from the left, it's probably one that needs to be resisted. Aaron, I'll go to you. What do you think about, how one should respond to the politics of all of this?
Yeah, when I heard the attacker, or the alleged attacker, was of Libyan descent, I believe he was born in Libya, came over here relatively recently, last couple of years. The first thing that came to mind was Salman Abedi, of course, the Manchester attack in 2017. Now, in the instance of Salman Abedi, he travelled abroad. He'd basically been given free range by the security services to travel to Libya in 2011 to help overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. His dad was an MI6 asset. I believe his name was, I can't remember, something Abedi. I think it was Ramadan Abedi was his father, who was a sort of member of a dissident group working to undermine Gaddafi in the 90s. Of course, Gaddafi was a real big enemy of Britain, particularly after the Lockerbie disaster, which was laid at the doorstep of the Libyans. So that was the first thing that came to mind. Was this somebody who traveled to Libya, to Syria, like Salman Abedi, who'd come back home and then done something, this awful deed in the name of a greater cause? What we know so far is that's not the case. This is somebody who's had significant mental health issues and so on. But it's worth keeping an eye on because with Salman Abedi, that took a few weeks to come out. And it ended up being a really huge story, which was, really, really poorly covered by the media. What was most striking, actually, in the case of Salman Abedi was that the only two journalists talking about it openly, this was somebody who killed dozens of people on British soil, who'd previously been sort of liaising with, British security services in Libya. The only people doing that were Peter Oborne and Peter Hitchens. It was generally not covered by the rest of the press. I'm not suggesting that's the case here. I actually doubt it from what we're seeing. But like I say, we should keep an eye on it.
I want to go quickly before I go to Ash to a take that Simon Jenkins gave in The Guardian today, which I thought was quite interesting at highlighting that this isn't necessarily like the Manchester bombing. It's not particularly organised. Let's just go to that quickly. So the headline, we are quick to label the Reading attack terrorism, but there is little benefit in doing so. And then a quote from the article, it seems this man had no link to any terror activity or network. He was never on the list of MI5's 3,000 subjects of interest. He shouted no Islamist slogans when allegedly committing the offence. His only significant trait, according to friends and family members interviewed, is that he had mental health problems and suffered psychotic episodes. According to one report, he had a very bad mental disturbance, which was exacerbated after going to prison in 2017 for a minor offence. Ash, do you agree with Simon Jenkins that we shouldn't really even be assuming this, can appropriately be called a terrorist attack?
I'm always wary about where the boundaries of terrorist attack are and aren't. So, for instance, in the Finsbury Park mosque attack, I called that a racist murder because I felt that fit much more appropriately within a particular history of racist murders that we have in this country. It was obviously political in its targeting, but so have many other murders been. And terrorism it's about one's relationship to the state and how you can be seen to be part of something that's much bigger. That then becomes a lot more difficult when you have, these lone wolf attacks, so-called, where people have been radicalized in isolation, really. They don't necessarily have to have had direct contact with any one person. They don't necessarily have to have been part of a cell. There was no command structure. How do you frame that when you take into account its relationship to the state, but then also other kinds of violent crime as well? So rather than getting too hung up on how you draw that distinction between a terrorist attack, a racist murder, a mass murder, I would like to go back and look at how was it that decisions were made to keep Khairi Saadallah in the community. Now, that means obviously looking at what the security services did or did not know. Are their monitoring activities impeded by the fact that they've got 40,000 people on this list and it simply means that you don't have the resources to look at everyone? Or is it the case that there were bad judgments or there wasn't the available information? So that's on one hand. And then the other hand is, of course, with mental health services. So he was known to mental health services. He'd been assessed, and it was something which was very clear and apparent amongst people who knew him as well, that he was a very troubled individual. Now, just really, really want to emphasize the point. The majority of people with mental health issues are more likely to be themselves hurt by another person than to hurt anyone themselves. So it's not simply saying, oh, well, I had mental health issues, obviously he was going to do something violent. That is a tiny, tiny percentage of people with mental health issues. However, when it's someone whose symptoms have included talking a lot about ISIS, he talked about both wanting to go abroad to fight ISIS and to fight with ISIS, someone who was very volatile, someone who was sort of drawn into almost like a clash of civilizations narrative. I think it's not just about, does that mean that you should be picked up by the security services, but do you need care, which is a lot more robust, muscular, and limits your contact with the community while that care is ongoing.
Should we go on to the bizarre lollipop gate conspiracy, or Aaron, do you want to come back in before we do that?
I think what's important sort of background music to this is that Libya's in a really bad way. In the last couple of days, the Egyptians have said that they might want to secure the port of Sirte in the north of the country. Naturally, it's a seaport. So Libya's in a really bad way, and people have said, well, why we could have deported him back to Libya. And I said, well, we made it into a failed state. I saw Darren Grimes say, failed state. It's like, yeah, there's been a permanent civil war because we decided to remove the head of state without having really any kind of plan for anyone to replace him. But that's a different conversation.
Let's go on to Orange Gate or Lollipop Gate. I don't know. What are we calling it? I'm not sure. But Ash, in any case, found herself caught up in a completely bizarre conspiracy theory in the wake of this attack. So it all started with Ash tweeting this of herself eating an orange ice lolly in a park with 3 orange emojis. That's the offending tweet. I think it's a great tweet, great pick, but other people didn't think so. So let's take a look at John Harrison's tweet, which got a bunch of retweets. I think this is what started it all. You might be able to correct me. He tweets, she's a weapons grade, I'm not even going to say it all, weapons grade C word. The timing of this post plus the fact she's put 3 oranges on it to represent the 3 dead people is quite frankly beyond disgusting. So this is sort of the origin of the conspiracy theory. Those 3 oranges represent the 3 people who were killed in the park. Graham Captain Kirk replies, Ash celebrating the Reading terror attacks with a lolly. Can't make this stuff up. Graham Captain Kirk, you might have made this up. And it went really off the deep end. Oh no, this is the one. This is, again, a very bizarre one. Imagine posting this straight after 3 people have lost their lives in a park. Now, I'm not saying 3 oranges definitely represent the 3 people killed. However, it wouldn't surprise me. And she definitely know what she's doing. This rape-basing little, again, is a C word, is a despicable person. And then this is the one that's really off the deep end. This is the theory is going quite deep here. Libya oranges production, suppliers, exports, and market insights market. Libya between 2014 and 2017, orange exports grew by 100%, earning Libya $0 million, doesn't make no sense. In 2017 alone, the oranges experts are categorized as fresh or dried. She supports terrorism. And someone wants to call the police. Twitter police, @Met Police. This vile political activist, Ash Sarkar, is celebrating the slaughter of 3 innocent white people in a park in Reading by posting this photo with 3 oranges to represent the people killed. How can this be allowed? @Sky News.
You missed the best
Ash.
one, Michael.
What do you think is the best one?
It was the Godfather conspiracy theory about oranges.
Oh, what was the Godfather? You're going to explain that before we go to... All right, Ash. I mean, on one level, this is kind of funny because you've got all of these people, especially when it goes into these wild conspiracy theories about Libyan orange exports. At the same time, I mean, you were at the center of, quite a terrifying pylon by people from the far right, often with violent death. It looked really, really horrible. So I suppose maybe you could tell us about, from your perspective, what the hell happened here?
I mean, from my perspective, I woke up and suddenly I had people saying that they wanted to douse me in petrol and set me on fire. People sending me pictures of nooses. People calling me a packy, calling me a slag. People saying that they hope that I meet a Joe Cox fanboy. And so it was like an avalanche, right, of really vile and violent fantasies. And when that happens, you try and look for, well, what is the connection here? What have I done that could have chimed with someone's worldview in a way to activate this kind of hatred, regardless of whether or not I find that worldview reasonable? It was this photo. Some people were suggesting that it was taken in the very same park as the Reading attacks took place. I live in East London, so no, that wasn't the case. And then people were suggesting that the 3 oranges represented 3 white people. I didn't know that oranges were slang for white people, and I don't think it has ever been used as slang for white people, but there we go. That the oranges were symbolizing my affinity with the Libyan state. I didn't even know that Libya grew oranges, but I'm not a fruit and veg expert. Maybe if I was, none of this would have happened. And also that oranges are a well-known symbol of death because of the way in which they appear in the Godfather trilogy, particularly when Vito Corleone dies. There are oranges in that scene, apparently. And so I think, like, on the one hand, it's obviously completely deranged, right? It's unhinged. It is really cuckoo stuff. But when you see the effect that it has in marshalling this violence, this racism, and this hatred, you clock that it's not simply a product of other people's stupidity or overactive imaginations. What it is what you might call stochastic terrorism. So it's a way of putting out information into the public sphere, which is not true, is definitely exaggerated, salacious, in order to make the possibility of random acts of violence against a particular person or community more likely. So that's what this whole thing was about. And it represents, I think, a quite worrying trend, which is a kind of, QAnon style politics infecting the British social media ecology. We've always had a far right in this country. Tends to be quite closely aligned with, football casuals and that kind of thing. But just as you have a kind of frictionless way of radicalizing people when it comes to, fundamentalist and, Islamist political causes, you also have a frictionless way of radicalizing people into the far right. This is the kind of material which is used to do it. It's holding up a target who is obviously, a young Muslim woman of color having fun, and you go, this is the kind of person who's threatening your lives. And it's to try and build up that real appetite for violence. And I think it also represents a step and a development in kind of Islamophobic hatred, because what was interesting to me is the way in which people were saying, well, obviously look at her, of course she sides with, Islamic terrorists. Well, there I am with, like, showing a fair bit of leg, eating a lolly in the park. I don't think that women in ISIS are really allowed to do that kind of thing. But that contradiction is kind of the point, because it's saying that, the pool of, Muslim who it's acceptable to hate, it's not just women in niqabs anymore. It's any of us who identify as Muslim or could be seen to be Muslim because of our ethnicity. So yeah, while I think that this is obviously completely batshit, right? These people are out of their gourd. We should also be really wary of the fact that they only believe this stuff because they want to believe it, and they want to believe it because there's a political purpose behind it.
I mean, it was there was a big, outpouring of solidarity on Twitter, quite rightly, and I think I'll probably echo all of our audience in saying solidarity with you, Ash, because you have to tolerate such dickheads just for being an incredibly articulate and talented person on the television who happens to not be a white man. Aaron, what was your take on this, bizarre phenomenon? What do you think is the political significance of this kind of thing? That this is the kind of thing that happens quite regularly now, these weird pylons by right-wing conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, well, a few things. First is Ash was in a park, dressed as you would be on a hot summer's day. And it goes to show that women of color, particularly Muslim women, can't win. If she was wearing a hijab, she would have got hate. If she was wearing a niqab, she would have got hate. If she was, quote unquote, integrating, she would have got hate. So it boils down to, this is not about whether or not somebody is willing to embrace the social mores of a particular society. It's about the color of their skin. It's the fact it was a brown woman having fun. That was the worst thing Ash did that day, was have fun, be entirely normal. That's what got the reaction that obviously was just disgusting that she received. So that's one part of it. Secondly, people saying, oh, Twitter's just crazy. Twitter's full of, wackos. I mean, perhaps. I mean, lots of people, if we presume 1 in 1,000 people misinterprets things often, yeah, sure. So many people on Twitter, you're going to get lots of strange reactions you simply don't encounter in real life, of course. But I think there's more to it than that. I think it's more organized than that, as Ash suggested with the reference to stochastic terrorism. I do think a significant amount of this stuff finds mass scale in other social media platforms, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Telegram, whether it's WhatsApp, whether it's what's called alt tech, like Gab. other platforms. We might be talking about one of them later on today's show. And so this is very much coordinated. There are far right Telegram and WhatsApp groups which coordinate this stuff, in a highly intelligent way. Other places too. This is covered in a range of increasingly well-researched literature. These guys know what they're doing. One example was, of course, the altered screen grab of a tweet by Jeremy Corbyn during the election wasn't real. This is the terrain that modern politics is now being fought on. And it's deeply concerning. And the reality is it does undermine the safety of not just people like Ash. I think everybody at Novara Media. I think Ash clearly as a brown woman is at the forefront of it. But I think anybody in trade union politics and left-wing politics, any person of color, any activist, anybody around LGBT rights, etc., this increasingly will be the kind of reality that you're confronted with. And it's deranged. But it is organized. We shouldn't confuse the content of what people are seeing, which is clearly nonsensical, with the manner in which it's organized, which is quite systematic often.
Let's go on to this new app that many of these wrong-uns have now joined. So in the wake of this weird conspiracy violent pile-on, I think Ash called for lots of people to report some of these users. I saw that many of these tweets had disappeared, so there was presumably some effect there. Twitter did manage to, put some of its regulatory, procedures in motion, which they're often incredibly slow to do. Twitter also, as we reported or as we covered on Friday, kicked Katie Hopkins from their platform. And this, it seems, has created a bit of a tidal wave of right-wing figureheads moving from Twitter to this new application. Now, what is Parler? We can get up an image of the app. Parler pitches itself as a version of Twitter that supports free expression. It boasts that it's uncensored, and it has become the home, basically, to the online far right and the Trumpian right. Since May, the website itself has been promoting what it's called a Twexit campaign. So it's a portmanteau, Twitter exit, like Brexit, but Twitter, to get right-wingers to elope from Twitter. This was especially after the row between Donald Trump and Twitter, where they just put a warning in front of a tweet he had put out, which basically most people interpreted as calling for violence against protesters. It was the one where he says, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. But it took a month for this to hit British shores. And this weekend was when we saw Twexit take hold in the UK. I found it very surprising, actually, because I often thought that many of these people on the right would, wanted to have this sort of barrier between themselves and Katie Hopkins, where they're like, she's beyond the pale, we're not like her. But actually, it was her getting kicked from Twitter that created this move. Let's get up some of the characters that went over. One of them is Darren Grimes, right-wing pundit, Brexiteer. Hopefully Parler app will work out. The chilling effect that big tech is placing on free speech, free expression and freedom of association is deeply troubling. Conservative thought, mainstream thought is under attack like never before. We'll see in a moment how mainstream the thought is on there. But it wasn't just right-wing pundits like Darren Grimes. Also, Tory MPs moved over to Parler this weekend. Let's take a look at a tweet from Ben Bradley. So he is moving over to Parler, having a crack at Parler. Giz a follow. He wasn't the only Conservative MP either. Steve Baker and Angela Richardson also joined. Emily Hewitson, who is another sort of popular right-wing pundit, often appears on Sky News, sometimes the BBC as well, I think. She tweeted, "Parler is brilliant. Such a contrast from this depressing left-wing echo chamber." Then a few hours later, it didn't take long. Only thing I would say, please don't use this app as an excuse to be racist. It's grim. So it didn't take very long for her to work out what this was really about. And in case you were wondering, is this app really racist? Are we just sort of tarnishing it? Is it just about free speech? This is Emily Hewitts again. Just saw someone call Parler the racist app. Do people ever learn? Calling people racist just because you disagree with them isn't normal behavior. Let's get up the hashtags. It's not just, abnormal to call this stuff problematic. So this was a Twitter user who typed in Muslims. So this is what you get if you type in Muslims on the Parler app. So Muslims, No Muslims is the second most popular. Muslims are invaders. Muslim Brotherhood. Deport all Muslims now. Muslims are terrorists. Ban Muslims. Muslims are not refugees. Muslim peace. Ban Muslim government. Let's get up the next one. I think we've got the idea. This is George Soros. So George Soros is always one of the trending ones on there. Arrest George Soros. I can't even read that one. George Soros.
It's Beelzebub incarnate.
What does that mean? Do you know what that
The
means?
devil.
The devil.
Ah, okay, good. George Soros pays Antifa. George Soros for the gallows. And then I think we can get up the general trending. So these are that's when you search Muslims or George Soros. Now let's get up the general trending hashtags on the app. Fox News, deep state propaganda, hashtag civil rights. I imagine they're not for them. Prey infiltration, treason, hashtag KKK, Democrat Party, voter fraud, which is the big Trump line at the moment. Obamagate, which still no one understands what Obamagate is. Deep state and voter ID, again, the big Trumpian issue that people are going to try and steal the election. I suppose I mean, there's a number of things to sort of question about this. I mean, one of them is, does the argument that Katie Hopkins getting banned from Twitter means that people will move into these underground applications, which means they can be even more violent, and that you've pushed it underground, and ultimately, I mean, the hope of the right wingers is that they'll create this new platform where they can get more powerful. I mean, Twitter has 327 million users. I think Parler at the moment less than 1 million. So, it's probably not the best argument. Well, what do you make of this exodus from Twitter to Parler? I'll go to Ash first.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting about the far right's tactic is that they're in power, right? They've won. They've got a government in Britain and America, two of the most powerful nations in the world. They've got a government which is very much aligned with their politics. And still, in order for their story to work, they've got to act as though the left are hegemonic everywhere, whether it's in the government, whether it's in the state apparatus, whether it's in the culture industry. It's actually Michael, me, you, and Aaron who are running everything. And so what that speaks to is I was listening to the new season of Slow Burn, which is about David Duke, the KKK Grand Wizard who won, I think, a race as a state senator in Louisiana in the 1980s, I believe it was. And he would appeal to his base by talking about being a forgotten majority. And so what they're trying to do is speak to this idea that, as Darren Grimes put it, mainstream opinion is, now becoming, somehow shameful and dirty, and it's being censored. Well, if that was the case, it would no longer be mainstream opinion, right? So you're having to hold these two completely contradictory ideas in hand at once. And it's about fostering the sense that really it's, white, reasonably well off, right? They're often young people speaking to an audience of older people, Gen Xers and boomers, who are truly oppressed. It's you who don't have a stake in society purely because you're operating within a pop cultural environment that thinks that you're all dinosaurs. And that's apparently an assault on your free speech rather than other people using theirs. So strategically moving to an app like, Parler, it might make it easier to organize certain things. For instance, I think it was highly likely that, a significant amount of what I experienced was due to, organization on that app. However, you're only powerful when you're speaking to that forgotten majority. Within the social media environment, you don't have the majority of people in the electorate who are on Twitter. But then again, Twitter is the biggest political social media app around, and even that's a minority of your electorate, and you're going to an even smaller one. I think that strategically it might not be that smart.
Aaron, I want to get you to comment on the Tory MP element of this, because, as I said, the timing of this isn't coincidental. On Friday, Katie Hopkins gets banned from Twitter. Over the weekend, lots of British right-wing pundits start tweeting the hashtag Twexit and moving over to Parler, where she's just moved. And, you could say this is just, marginal people. It doesn't really matter. But you had 3 Tory MPs tweet that they were doing the same. So Ben Bradley, Stephen Baker, and Angela Richardson are basically all joining in a movement to go to a far right application or an application that's become home to the far right, precisely because Katie Hopkins has moved over there. I mean, it seems bizarre that they felt comfortable tweeting about that this weekend.
Well, these are the sort of hardcore of their culture war warriors. And I think, if you're a conservative, why would you be on Twitter? You've got the mainstream media. Darren Grimes and Emily Hewitson go on the BBC every day, and people say, well, Novara go on there too. Well, actually, nowhere near as much as them. And I think we've actually got something to say. But secondly, look, if you want to get the radical left off the BBC and off Sky, and you want to do the same to people like Hewitson and Douglas Murray, and I don't think our politics are analogous, but if you want to do that, the right are going to take a far bigger hit than the left are. BBC Question Time every week has somebody with those politics, whether it's an Isabel Oakeshott or a Julia Hartley-Brewer. If you look at the roster on LBC, Farage left recently. He was there for a while. Katie Hopkins used to have a show there. Nick Ferrari. Ian Dale. Ian Dale he did the show the other day with Peter Oborne, and Peter Oborne's listing all these sort of racist things which Boris Johnson's done. He said, well, I don't think they're racist. He goes, well, are you a racist then, Ian? Perfectly normal question. Ian Dale gets, don't call me a racist. Of course, Ian Dale constantly, his career is apologizing for people who are racist. His great line in the 2017 general election was, let Linton be Linton, let Linton Crosby be Linton Crosby, i.e. let the Conservatives win this on the basis of racism, bigotry and division. That's what his stock in trade is. So in a sense, I wonder why they get so upset about Twitter. And it's the one thing they don't do particularly well at. As Ash has said, it's not particularly influential in the grand scheme of things. It's good at sort of setting the landscape for broadcast journalists, but other than that, not really. If you think about it, they're even they've got this victim complex, even in regards to the BBC and the new Director General. The new Director General was literally a member of the Conservative Party. In the 1990s, he was running as a Conservative councillor candidate. I mean, what more would you like? It defies belief. But again, it taps back into a really essential point. The modern right has no understanding of political economy, has no solutions to the big crises of our era. Nobody thinks that things have gone forward in the last 10 years. We've had 10 years of Tory government. Everybody knows things have gone backwards, whether it's home ownership, living standards, wages, schools, hospitals, public transport. Nobody thinks things are getting better. All they have is this paranoid style. That's what they have, the paranoid style. Great essay by Richard Hofstadter in the 1960s. And it seems to be getting worse. And what I think this reflects is actually the politics of anti-communism. Of course, anti-communism was a huge substrate of right-wing thinking during the Cold War. It feels like anti-communist sort of thinking and rhetoric is now just basically going on to social democracy. And I think that's what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. And I think a lot of the left, a lot of the centre-left, because they don't like Jeremy Corbyn, don't see that for what it is. The same thing more or less happened to Ed Miliband. The same thing will happen to Keir Starmer. Anti-communism, the lens of anti-communism is now inflected upon anything which deviates from right-wing social conservatism and effectively sort of neoliberal economics. And for a free society, that's really, really troubling. And so there's the explanation as to why they have this victim complex. It's constitutive of their very politics, because without it, they have nothing else.
We're finding ourselves talking about a lot of right-wing nut jobs with victim complexes, and we are going to go to the main one, the main guy in this crew, which is Donald Trump. Donald Trump held his first campaign rally this weekend. It had been held up because of coronavirus. We would have imagined him speaking to, sizable crowds up until now. How sizable we'll see in a moment, not as big as he might have hoped. His rambling speeches always do provide for surreal, if deeply concerning, entertainment, and this one didn't disappoint. Let's take a look at the choice moment from his speech in Tulsa.
And what we've done with the ventilators and with the medical equipment and with testing, testing is a double-edged sword. We've tested now 25 million people. It's probably 20 million people more than anybody else. Germany's done a lot. South Korea's done a lot. They call me, they say, the job you're doing. Here's the bad part. When you do testing to that extent, you're going to find more people. You're going to find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please. They test and they test. We got tests that people don't know what's going on. We got tests. We got another one over here. The young man's 10 years old. He's got the sniffles. He'll recover in about 15 minutes. That's a case. Add up to it. That's a case.
So, I mean, coronavirus has killed more than 100,000 people in America. Calling it the sniffles is probably not appropriate. But the main thing that, came from that speech, and I suppose which set Twitter alight and the mainstream media, was that he said he told people to stop testing because he didn't like how many people were being found positive. So that would be an incredibly dangerous, life-threatening thing for a president to do. His defenders have been out saying, oh, you just can't take a joke. It was a funny joke. Why are all these liberals pretending that that what he said was meant to be taken seriously? The problem for those guys is that Trump doesn't seem to think it was a joke. He was asked about that part of his speech earlier today. Let's take a look at his response.
On Saturday night, you said that you told your staff to slow the testing down to improve the numbers. Does that mean someone watching this right now on their local news is not going to get a test because you asked your staff?
We do more testing than any country in the world by far. 25 million tests. Other countries do 1 million. Every time you do a test, as you do more tests, it shows more and more cases. So we're so far advanced, both in terms of the quality and the amount. And we're doing all these tests, and it shows cases. If other countries aren't doing, or if we did slow it down, we wouldn't show nearly as many cases. You're showing people that are asymptomatic. You're showing people that have very little problem. You're showing young people that don't have a problem. But we're doing so much testing, 25 million tests. Nobody thought that was
But did you
possible.
ask to slow it down?
If it did slow down, frankly, I think we're way ahead of ourselves, if you want to know the truth. We've done too good a job, because every time we go up with 25 million tests, you're going to find more people. So then they say, we have more cases in the United States. The reason we have more cases, because we do more testing than any other country by far.
He could have said, it was a joke. It was a joke. Why can't these people take a joke? It clearly wasn't a joke. I mean, Trump has, it seems, told people in positions of authority to slow down testing because he doesn't like how many people are coming out as positive with coronavirus. I mean, you could not have, I mean, it's bizarre. Ash, what do you make of this? Are you still ever surprised by what Donald Trump says? Should we just ignore him?
I don't think you can ignore him. And I don't think you should be surprised either. What you need to bear in mind is that the man chats shit. He just chats a load of shit all the time. And you actually see a similar thing with Boris Johnson, which is they have no regard for the job that they're there to do, right? Which is to govern, which is to, shape legislation, which is to, lead a country in a way which is for the betterment of the public rather than for their own ego. So they don't like detail, they don't like preparation, and they've had their whole lives being told that everything they do is spectacular because, they were both born very rich, that they could just coast by, right? Fly by. And people warmed to, and, Donald Trump, he does have his own very bizarre brand of charisma. He's funny. Is that's enough to not have to, prepare for these things at all. So you can't look at him through the prism of, do you mean what you're saying or not? Are you being truthful or are you lying? He's just saying some shit at one moment that he felt was an appropriate thing to say. And then at a later moment when pulled up on it, if he said he was only joking, I think in his mind, he's like, oh, well, that would be backing down. So why would I back down on that point? And it's all through the lens of how he feels at that time. What I'm more interested in, one of the things that concerns me a lot more, is that 100,000 people have died in the United States. Over 40,000 people, at least in this country, have died because of coronavirus. And yet, the core voting demographics, which have, propelled Donald Trump and Boris Johnson into power, seemingly don't care. And I think that does speak to something which is quite worrying in terms of the complete degrading of the public sphere for, the last decade, really. Because what that speaks to is, I think, a kind of cruelty, a kind of callousness, despising almost people who were, weak enough to get the disease and to die, despising anyone who wants this to be taken seriously, as though, well, you're just a bleeding heart liberal, or, oh, you're just, you're a champagne socialist, or, oh, you're always moaning. This real scorn and lack of curiosity for your fellow citizen, I think, is a defining characteristic of, both these sort of voting bases. And then in particular, when it comes to Donald Trump, and I think that this is why some of his voters like him, if not a significant number of them, is, do you remember the Ta-Nehisi Coates essay that he wrote just after the 2016 election? Does anyone remember reading that? I thought it was a brilliant work. And one of the things that he said drove the Trump vote. And Ta-Nehisi Coates is, I'm a Cornell West girl all the way, but I think sometimes he finds these things which are so true and so resonant, and that you can only know them to be true because you read it and you feel it. And it's, that's a brilliant writer. One of the things that he wrote is that, the first Black president had to be, articulate, educated, poised, cool, unflappable, right? I don't back Obama's politics at all, in particular drone warfare and deportations. However, there's no denying the man was exceptional in every way, right? Formidably intelligent, incredibly competent. That was the first Black president. And then the next president that followed him is literally the worst person in the world. And what Ta-Nehisi Coates said is that itself is an expression of white supremacy. It's like it takes the most extraordinary man to become the first Black president of the United States. But it can be any white man. And in fact, it will be our most degraded white man, our most ignorant white man, our most obnoxious white man who will be the president following the first Black president of the United States. And so when I watch things like that of Donald Trump, that's what I think of. And I look at the enjoyment of those people in the audience who like it because it's a celebration of mediocrity, the celebration of ignorance, and a celebration of American exceptionalism and being obnoxious. And that's what worries me, because it's bigger than Trump.
If you are looking for celebrations of mediocrity, let's get up the highlight of the speech according to Trump's fan base. So this is Deanne Lorraine. She's a former congressional candidate, so she's not just some nobody. She's got about 300,000 Twitter followers. The degenerate left claimed President Trump had health issues after drinking water with two hands. Today, he drank with one and tossed the glass to the side. Greatest president ever. Aaron, can this go on? I mean, actually, there was an interesting poll today that was showing that Biden is ahead in the popularity ratings, as it were, but Trump still is way ahead in terms of people who are voting for Trump. Most of Biden's support is still people voting against the president, not for Joe Biden. So there is an enthusiasm gap. But I mean, it does seem. I mean, do you think he can win like this? Do you think he's going to have to change his tune somewhat?
I think Biden's the favorite to win. But Biden's vote is much softer than Donald Trump's. So you're right. I think Donald Trump, let's say he's only got 25% of the electorate right now, whatever. It's pretty rock solid. Like he said so memorably in 2016, I could go down, Fifth Avenue, shoot somebody and they'd still vote for me. Joe Biden doesn't have that. And there's two things to think about here. Firstly, voter disenfranchisement. And I really mean this. This can win Donald Trump the election. If you look at basically the 2008 US presidential election, turnout is massively up on 2000. That's the difference between Al Gore and Obama in 2000, 2008. Turnout goes massively up. Places like North Carolina go Democrat. And since that happened, North Carolina went Democrat in 2008, I believe 2012 as well. You've had mass voter disenfranchisement. How have you done it? You have fewer voting stations in primarily black areas. You get rid of early voting, that tends to be African Americans. You mandate, necessary ID and so on. You create loads of barriers. And so I think just through that alone, it could be really close. If you do that really effectively in half a dozen states, just as a result of the electoral college system, it's really, really close. And people forget, if just 2 in 100 people in 4 states in the last election had gone one way or the other, Hillary would have won. And we wouldn't have had this huge conversation about the resurgence of the far right and Donald Trump and white nationalism. But actually, the sort of macro reality would have been more or less the same, because of that electoral college system. it turns on so few votes in so few places. And so, of course, Trump can win. That's why Trump can win. If it was down to the popular vote, I wouldn't give him a hope in hell, because Hillary Clinton got she got 3 million more than him in 2016, and she was despised. Hillary Clinton is disliked by much of the electorate, and with great justification, and she still hammered him in the popular vote. So of course he can win. But I mean, it says a lot about the state of the American Republic, the US Republic, that your choices are Joe Biden, who can barely form sentences, and Donald Trump, who can barely form sentences. It speaks to a republic in decay, a political system in decay. If you think people who are our age, who's a standout millennial politician? Okay, AOC, right? There's a couple, but more or less, Nancy Pelosi is 80 years old. She's the most senior Democrat politician. She is a multimillionaire who is 80 years old. Now, I'm not being ageist, but that tells you that America is a plutocracy. It's going towards a system of government for the rich, by the rich. The question is, over the next 5-10 years, can working people pierce that? I think there's a chance. It's not coming with Joe Biden, by the way, but I do think there's a chance.
I mean, I think sometimes we forget that it is possible to integrate both a generational analysis and a class analysis. And things get really wonky when you try and treat these things as separate, whereas they're really, they're intimately put together. Baby boomers are the single most wealthy, privileged generation who have ever lived in history. Baby boomers across the global north, so Britain and America. When you look at property, when you look at increases in life expectancy, all of these things just spectacularly well off. And yet we've got this, collapse in living standards for millennials. God knows how it's going to be for Generation Z and the Zoomers. We're locked out of participating fully in the economy because we don't have assets which appreciate in value, i.e. a house, and wages are stagnant. In real terms, they've been falling for about 10 years. It's a huge division of wealth and therefore power along generational lines. And one of the things that we forget when we talk about, have social democratic parties lost the support of the working class? Well, no, not in the sense of the working class, but yes, very much so in terms of, the sort of C to D, E age bracket and class bracket, right? That's where that support has been lost. And so one of the things that I think will be really important to pay attention to is that demographics are shifting only in one direction. And we're talking in terms of age, but also in terms of diversity and ethnic makeup and blah, blah, blah. It will take increasingly authoritarian means, anti-democratic means, to preserve a balance of power in the interests of a dying generation, right? You cannot have that social organization and a democracy at the same time, right? Those two things are in conflict. And I'm not sure how that resolves itself. And in fact, I'm becoming more and more, I think, alarmed, particularly at the state of America, and already this trashing of the electoral process that we're seeing by Trump as a means of beginning to degrade and dismantle democracy.
And can I add one more thing? Can I add one more thing? Sorry.
Go on.
2000 election, Bush wins Florida, we think, by several hundred votes. We know the Democrats would have won that state if you had a level of, basically there was a huge disenfranchisement of African-American votes in Florida. If they had the same levels of non-disenfranchisement, if there were the same protocols you had in California or New York State, the Democrat Party would have won Florida by thousands of votes. So this isn't new. But it's really, like Ash says, it's going to become increasingly sort of overt and conspicuous to stop the democratic will of the people being instantiated in a non-right-wing, non-conservative head of state.
Unless the Zoomers get organized on TikTok. That's going to be my tenuous segue. So, as well as what Trump said at the rally, news reports focused on disappointing attendance. The venue in Tulsa has an attendance or capacity of 19,000, but only 6,000 turned up. Now, this could show a waning enthusiasm for Trump. I think it probably does to some extent. Or it could be the fruits of an ingenious plan by TikTok teens. Let's take a look at some quotes from Reuters on this story. So TikTok users and fans of Korean pop music took partial credit for inflating attendance expectations at a less than full arena at President Donald Trump's first political rally in months, held in Tulsa, Oklahoma on Saturday. Social media users on platforms, including the popular video sharing app, have said they completed the free online registration for the rally with no intention of going. Is this the first sign of Zoomers? Well, it's not the first sign of Zoomers getting organized, actually. I think it's lots of Zoomers who are behind the Black Lives Matter movement. But it does seem like they potentially had some real impact here, signing up for loads of tickets to help, I suppose, promote or create that image that was broadcast all across the American news network of Trump speaking to basically an empty arena. I actually thought that what was going to happen is that Trump was going to say, yes, this is why it was empty. I thought he was going to jump on the opportunity to blame online activists. He quite likes that kind of culture war element. But no, they actually chose to downplay this part of the story. Let's go to some quotes from that same article. So the campaign said entry was on a first come, first served basis, as in, no one was turned away. They said leftists always fool themselves into thinking they're being clever. Registering for a rally only means you've RSVP'd with a cell phone number, Trump campaign spokesman Tim Murtaugh said in a statement. But we thank them for their contact information. Pascal said in a statement the campaign weeds out bogus phone numbers and did this with tens of thousands at the Tulsa event in calculating possible attendance. It's interesting. It's like either the Trump campaign had a decision. They could say, either Trump's, unpopular, there isn't the same enthusiasm this time around as there was in 2016, or they could admit they got owned by a bunch of Zoomers on TikTok. And for some reason, they've decided they prefer the idea that they're just organically unpopular as opposed to they got owned by Zoomers on TikTok. Aaron, I'll go to you. You're surprised they went for that strategic choice. They'd prefer to be seen as unpopular than weak, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess so. You've also got the alibi of the coronavirus lockdown. I suppose to get, it was 9,000 allegedly in the end. To get 9,000 in the context of coronavirus is good, but I suppose again in the context of the people that support Donald Trump, I mean, how much of a variable is it? But like you say, actually, this isn't really the first instance we've seen of Zoomers, Gen Z, people who were born late 1990s, early 2000s. Think Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho, making a big political kind of intervention. You think of Black Lives Matter, absolutely, but also the climate strike movement is really driven by people in their later teens, early 20s. And then going back to Marcus Rashford and Jadon Sancho, these are people with quite explicit political commitments. And I often think that sort of celebrities and major cultural figures, they do reflect the broader politics of their age demographic. And so I think that's really, really interesting. And obviously it's a positive thing. But going back quickly to the millennial thing, and people were talking about some of the comments I saw about, oh, well, I'm 60 and I'm left wing or whatever. Great piece of data, and this applies also to Zoom as well I'm bringing up now. In the Washington Post, said that in the late, basically, if you were over 65, you're 50% better off now as somebody over 65 than you would have been in 1989. And somebody aged between 25 and 34, you're 50% worse off. The number of people in their 30s has tripled in the last 20 years in this country. 1 in 3 men between 20 and 34, 1 in 3 live at home with their parents. These are really, really new phenomena. And I think what's really important to state with Zoomers in particular, with these younger people, is that all of those trends are only getting worse for them. And whereas millennials came into a political context where, yes, the old had passed away, but we weren't quite sure if it was coming back. At Novara Media, we stated quite clearly, that's gone forever, after 2008. And increasingly, we've been proven right. I think people now in their early 20s understand that the world of the 1980s, the 1990s, pretty much everybody can afford to, we had home ownership in this country only 10, 12 years ago of 75%. Now it's around 65%. And that's not because people in their 50s and 60s can't afford houses anymore. It's just young people. And it's a really, really important transition. Now, does that mean by necessity that Zoomers are, the vanguard of the revolution? No, not at all. But they're going to be increasingly influential. I think in 2019, millennials, people that sort of, what's the cliche of millennials in the media is, oh, they're all, on college campuses and on social media, not doing anything. Since 2019, millennials are the largest age cohort in full-time employment in the United States. It's the backbone of the US economy. And yet they have very little political representation. They have very little media representation. The same applies here in the UK. And so I think, we're going to see that phenomenon on steroids when it comes to Generation Z.
Ash, do you think Generation Z are going to save us briefly before we go on to our final story?
I sure hope so. I mean, the other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that Zoomers are digital natives. So when it comes to being able to use social media platforms for creative political purposes, they are going to be way, way ahead of anything that's come before. And they've also been steeped in a very progressive pop culture. And that's also why when you see young conservatives of both the big and small C variety, they're so damn weird, because they're people who really are having to sustain themselves devoid of any kind of cultural hinterland whatsoever. Because think about who the most popular recording artists, in the world are today. Dua Lipa, explicit Labour supporter, Beyonce, supporter of Black Lives Matter, sports stars, comedians, actors. Every single person you see in the public eye holds generally progressive opinions. Now, some of them might also be, celebrities, I think, of every era are, fairly vapid. But this has, I think, been one of the most politically engaged, generations of celebrity that there has ever been. And so, Zoomers are growing up steeped in that popular culture. And I think that's one thing that's worth bearing in mind.
We are going to go on to our final story. First of all, if you're enjoying the show, please like the video. It helps us in the algorithm, and make sure you subscribe. We're actually going to be going live more than usual this week. Tomorrow we have 2 shows. One is going to be me and Ash Sarkar at 7. My apologies. I'm speaking to 3 top politicians from around Europe. Euclid Sakalotos from Syriza. Katja Kipping from Die Linke and John McDonnell from the Labour Party. Then Aaron, tell us about what you were going to be doing afterwards. Who are you interviewing? I'm
talking to Priya Gopal, who's written a great book, Insurgent Empire. Really, really amazing book. And I was unaware of actually just how much solidarity there was between elements of the global north and the global south in the 19th century. Reading about 19th century liberal MPs comment on the murder of a Jamaican businessman, and working class publications saying, well, they have every right to assert their right of sort of insurrection against a government as we do. They're human beings, and I wasn't aware of the proliferation of those ideas to such an extent. So really exciting book and a great guest.
All right, final story. And it is the question on everyone's lips: when will we be able to go back to the pub? And the government are expected to announce a lowering of the 2-meter rule to the 1 meter, so that pubs, restaurants, and other businesses in the hospitality sector can reopen. If it's 2 meters, they can't really make a profit. With 1 meter, they might have some hope of doing so, which means they can open. That doesn't mean, though, that they'll be coming back as usual. Let's take a look at a story in today's Times. So they write, in an attempt to prevent the move from pushing up the transmission rate, so that's the lowering from 2 meter to 1 meter, ministers are drawing up measures to ensure that venues minimize risks and allow health officials to rapidly trace new clusters of infections. This is likely to include a new requirement to register when you go to a bar or restaurant and provide contact details for every member of the group. These details would be held for several weeks, and if someone at a venue later tested positive for coronavirus, everyone else who might have had contact with them at the venue could be told to isolate. Matt Hancock, the health secretary, confirmed yesterday that the measure was being examined. This is the sort of thing that we are looking at for how you do make it safe to open things, he told Sophie Ridge on Sunday on Sky News. He cited the example of New Zealand, which has imposed similar restrictions. Hospitality venues there must maintain a COVID-19 guest register, including the date and time of a patron's entry, as well as their full name, address, phone, and email address. Now, what to make of this story? I think in normal times, we'd find it a bit of a encroachment on our liberty to have to give all of your contact details every time you go into a pub. In this situation, I think people probably will be willing to. The question it raises for me, though, is New Zealand is being used as the example. And in New Zealand, at the moment, they have no cases. I think, well, they might have 2, which were transported from Britain. But because they have no cases, it means it's quite unlikely that you're going to go into a pub with someone with coronavirus. Here in this country, if we've still got 5,000 cases a day or whatever, then you are quite likely to go into a pub with someone with coronavirus, which means that if you are getting told, if you visited a pub at the same time as someone who had symptoms, you have to self-isolate, that means the cost of going to a pub in terms of what you might be able to do over the following weeks is really high. I mean, Aaron, how likely are you to go to a pub given that you could get a text 3 days later saying someone in the pub had coronavirus, you now have to self-isolate for 2 weeks?
Well, I think it's, first of all, you're absolutely right on the technicalities of track and trace, but I do think it's manageable that you would be able to, you can monitor numbers in any kind of establishment much better. You would have, I don't know if I was sent, because I'm a member of Pure Gym. I got a video today. Pure Gym, their pitch is basically how they're going to reopen. And I was watching the video and I was going, yeah, this kind of makes sense. So on the app, you'll have an app now to log in, no using of a code. So that removes that. You'll go in, already it's heavily automated anyway. You go in, you'll have sort of times of when's best to go, real time kind of data around how many people are in the gym and whether you'll be able to get in or not. Are there queues for using equipment? And then tape around, a particular machine or whatever, constantly cleaning things. And that, look, we're clearly going to we're going to get an R rate clearly above 1, right? We shouldn't be doing this. But in terms of minimizing kind of the spread, I was like, I think that probably will be very effective. And I imagine something similar will happen with bars and pubs, and also with retail. What this could do is, if this is a new normal, it's really going to accelerate a lot of the trends I talk about in my book, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, which is now out in paperback. And for people who, if you're watching this on YouTube, after you finish watching this, just put in Amazon Go. That's the kind of the pilot for what Amazon want to do with offline retail. And that's how a lot of stores will work. What does that look like? You log in with a phone app. You don't have to open a door. You go in, you put your things in your basket, you walk out, it debits your account. And that may be what Tesco looks like. It's far more frictionless in terms of your engagement with other people, but it's also great for them because it means they get rid of lots of employees. So this could be a real accelerating factor in the automation of the economy, which from a perspective of inequality and underemployment is terrible. But it's something we should stay vigilant on the left.
I was kind of surprised. I thought when shops started opening, people still wouldn't go back to them, because I'm not in the mood to go shopping. I feel like if you feel like there's a bit of a risk of getting it, you're in an enclosed space, why wouldn't you just get it online? But we are seeing massive queues for places like IKEA. So I mean, it seems like people are willing to go into spaces with a bit of risk, even if it's very different the way you have to operate inside them. Ash?
I mean, think about it. There's been a war of attrition on the public's willpower when it comes to adhering to lockdown guidance. And that's been the case, I think, pretty much from like 3 or 4 weeks in, is that you've got this drumbeat of when are we going to come out of lockdown? When are we going to go back to normal? When are we going to be able to do all these things that we like to do again? Whether it's pubs, restaurants, theatres, shopping, or seeing family. And it's something which has also been really fed in by this quite chaotic media operation from Downing Street, where they'll test one line out on a Sunday night. And so everyone's talking about, will we be able to go back into pubs this week on the Monday? And then by Tuesday, they're saying, no, of course this won't happen. And what that does is that it does just weaken people's ability to stick to what's going on, because there's a lack of clear communication. And even if you're not watching the Downing Street briefing religiously anymore, it's got this like drip effect. So I think that that's a really big bit of it. And when it comes to thinking about risk, there's no one single factor which is decisive in risk. It's multiple factors. So when you look at, say, take the 2-meter rule, there are some studies which suggest it's between 10 and 30 times riskier to go to 1 meter rather than 2 meters, because it's closer. People are then less likely to, keep themselves. There are sort of casual touches, closing of distance, that kind of thing. So it's suggested that it is actually quite a big risk. Now, if you're in a country which has got a very, very, very low number of infections, close to 0, shall we say, 1 meter rule is pretty fine, right? That's not really that big a risk. And when you think about the kind of trade-offs involved in terms of, impact on the hospitality industry, stuff like that, education, you go, well, it's better off having the 1 meter rule, a little bit more of a risk, because generally things are much more manageable. Another thing might be having a contact tracing app up and running. So it's just a really easy way to be able to see where your infection is, right? If you've got a functional testing program, it's still the case that people are having to wait a very long time to get their test results back. They're ordering tests and not necessarily receiving them. They have to reorder them. All of these things are currently in disarray. And so if you can't find and test and trace and isolate, right, those cases that you've got then going from 2 meters to 1 meter, it becomes a whole lot riskier. So I think one of the things that we need to do is, rather than going, oh, but we could be more like New Zealand, or like, oh, look, Germany's reopening, is ask ourselves why our state is so dysfunctional. Because coronavirus has been a pretty good test of a state's capacity to do basic things, right? A state's capacity to lock down quickly, right? To communicate clearly, to staff its emergency services adequately. And Britain has been falling down at absolutely every hurdle. Perhaps the only more, dysfunctional state that there is America. But that's not company that we want to be keeping when it comes to the quality of our healthcare. So I kind of feel like how we have these conversations about risk, it needs to be really contextualized with these things are achievable, right? They're within reach. So why can't we have them? It's actually because we're governed by a bunch of dickheads.
A brilliant note to end tonight's show on. Thank you, everyone, for your super chats tonight. Lots of them have come with solidarity for Ash Sarkar, which is always lovely to see. If you want to support us directly, then you can go to novaramedia.com/support. Tizki Sauer will be back on Wednesday, but me, Aaron, and Ash will all be back tomorrow. Me and Ash will be back from 7 p.m. for a debate with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation on the post-COVID-19 world. It's going to be an excellent discussion. Then at 8:30, the Bastani Factor will be on at a slightly later time, but it will be an unmissable show. Please do hit the subscribe button not to miss any of that. You've been watching Tizki Sauer on Novara Media. Good night.